The movie opens with a quiet night over Brightwood. 4 lights shine in the sky from both sides as a helicopter appears, breaking the silence and lighting up the darkness before disappearing over the mountain. In a dense forest filled with tall trees, small glowing lights dot some of the branches. A drop of liquid falls from a glowing flower, and a man's shoe steps into view. The men, wearing protective suits and goggles, carry chemicals and spray the liquid on the trees. Abby, holding a pen in one hand, picks up her notebook and writes, "Original research project topic of your choice, partner, Abby Tansey." She places the notebook beside Jake. As the bell rings, students pour out of the building. Jake's friends, all teenagers, walk home together. Charles, who loves archaeological science and runs his own channel, holds a book about extraterrestrials seeding life on Earth. Jake joins the group, greeting them. His father passed away 2 years ago,
I bet you miss him, huh?
and his mother, a nurse, takes care of him and his brother Mike. While walking on a new road, Charles holds a book and tells them he found another citation from a site claiming aliens will arrive in Brightwood. Max laughs. Einstein urges Charles to be logical, questioning why aliens would visit Brightwood instead of anywhere else, given their advanced technology. Jake hands Charles his exam paper and says he needs his help. Charles looks at the paper and sees an F grade at a place where street art covers the ground. Mike is with his friend. He is working on his street art when the sound of a car interrupts him. It's a police car. Mike grabs his bag, but the officer calls out. It is Officer Alan Faraday. Mike sarcastically asks Alan if his mission is to rid the world of street art. Alan reminds him this is his 3rd warning. He then tells him to get in the car. In the police car, Alan drives as Mike sits beside him. Mike asks where they're going, and Alan says he's taking him home
I'm taking you home.
because he doesn't want to upset Mike's mom. Mike, upset about his mom trying to move on after their dad's death, replies bitterly, saying everyone feels obligated to look after her. Alan defends Jennifer, telling Mike she's a good woman. At the hospital, Jennifer enters a patient's room, holding her materials. She greets Doris as a doctor follows her inside. The doctor asks the patient, Mrs. Murcher, how she's doing. The patient removes her glasses and the doctor examines her eyes with a light. The doctor calls Jennifer's name, looking concerned. He opens a drawer, pulls out some papers, and tells her he has news. Jennifer takes the papers, sits down, and reads them silently with a serious expression. The doctor explains that it's just the beginning and mentions the investigation happening Saturday morning in town. Jake arrives home and notices his new neighbor, Abby, and her dad moving their belongings into their house. As he watches, a police car pulls up in front of his home. Officer Alan Faraday tells Mike, who is standing nearby, to stay away from the Jonas Kid.
Do yourself a favor and stay away from that Jonas kid.
Mike sarcastically responds by asking Alan to do him a favor and stay away from his mother, slamming the car door shut. Jake watches from where he stands as his brother, Mike, interacts with the officer. When Jake turns his head, he notices Abby waving at him, and he waves back. Mike sees this and teases Jake. He then playfully grabs Jake by the neck, causing him to fall to the ground. The police car remains parked outside. Upset, Jake asks Mike why he always acts this way. Mike replies with a grin, saying he's good at it and always does this kind of thing to him. As Jake tries to pick up his open bag, its contents spill out. Overwhelmed, he scrambles to collect his belongings. Meanwhile, Abby and her dad continue unloading their things and moving into their home. Jake enters his bedroom, places his bag on the table, and tosses his exam paper, marked with an F, onto the desk. He sits in his chair, facing the window, and notices Abby and her dad. Turning back to his desk, he opens a box filled with photographs and picks out a few. He moves closer to the window, holding a picture of a house, and realizes it matches the house Abby and her parents just moved into. Jake sticks the picture to the window. Jennifer, Jake, and Mike's mom arrive home in her car. Alan, still in his police car, gets out, holding his glasses and police cap in his hands. Jennifer greets him warmly, surprised to see him.
What a pleasant surprise.
Alan explains that he came because of Mike's behavior, saying Mike was causing trouble again. Jennifer looks concerned, but Alan assures her it's okay for now, though Mike needs to improve his behavior. Jennifer promises to talk to him. As she heads to her house, Alan asks if she'd like to get together sometime, and Jennifer replies that she'd like that. Inside the house, upstairs, Jake sits in his bedroom at his desk, holding a book titled Guide to Marine Animals. He places the box of pictures on the desk and examines the book's cover. He hears his mom calling his name and asking him to come downstairs. Holding the book, Jake leaves his room to join her. In the kitchen, Jennifer looks at the paper on the table as Jake comes in and sits in front of her. She turns over the card showing Jake's grades and asks him to explain. The first card lists good grades, but the second one shows lower grades. Jennifer tells him he's grounded for a week and advises him to talk to her if he's struggling instead of making bad choices. That night, Einstein, Charles, and Max arrive at Jake's house on bikes, holding flashlights. Charles, wearing a helmet, picks up a stone and throws it at Jake's bedroom window. Jake, lying on his bed, hears the sound. He opens the window and asks what they're doing. Charles says they're planning to go somewhere and want him to join. Jake declines, explaining that he's grounded.
Charles, I just told you I'm grounded.
Charles asks what Jennifer said, and Jake replies that his mom is mad. After a while, Jake finally agrees and sneaks out of his room, closing the window behind him. Abby notices them from her bedroom mirror. Outside, Einstein, Charles, and Max stand in a circle, holding their bikes. Charles shines a flashlight on a map he's holding. Abby approaches and says hi, startling them. She asks what they're doing. Jake introduces Abby to his friends and explains their plan. Abby finds it cool and asks if she can join. Jake says it's fine, though the others complain. Charles argues that it's dangerous, but Abby insists it'll be fun and runs to grab her bike. Einstein mutters that he doesn't understand girls, and Max jokes that girls, especially pretty ones, are from Venus. Charles, Einstein, and Max ride off, leaving Jake behind. Jake waits for Abby, and when she arrives with her bike, they ride together to catch up with the others. The group arrives at a forest. They lay their bikes on the ground and walk into the woods, using their flashlights to guide the way. As they search, Jake complains to Charles about already spending 30 minutes when Charles promised it would only take an hour. Charles spots something and alerts the group. Jake and Abby notice glowing flowers that emit their own light. Abby, fascinated, touches a glowing drop and talks about studying it in class.
Don't think that's a good idea.
Jake warns it might be harmful. Einstein yells at Charles not to touch anything as he's holding the only flashlight. Charles shouts back, asking why Einstein brought just one flashlight. Abby asks Jake and Einstein if Charles is always like this. They explain he gets overly excited about discoveries. Abby, curious, asks what they're looking for, but they admit they haven't found it yet. Suddenly, they hear Max's voice calling them. They rush toward him and an electric shock erupts. Max screams and the group shouts at him, calling him an idiot. Later, Jake sneaks back home, holding his flashlight. But when he turns on the light, he finds Jennifer sitting in a chair, while Jake lies on his bed. Jennifer opens his bedroom door and tells him his friend Abby is here to work on their project. Jake gets out of bed, and Abby enters. Jake tries to talk to her, but Abby interrupts, saying he has to see what she brought. Jake asks what she's showing him. Abby sets up the microscope. At first, Jake sees nothing. Abby makes another adjustment, and this time Jake sees colorful, moving particles. He asks what it is, and Abby replies she doesn't know and suggests they'd need chemical analysis to find out. She jots down notes in her exercise book. Jake starts to ask her something, but Abby's phone rings. After a quick conversation, Abby tells Jake she has to leave, but urges him to keep working.
Just follow my notes.
Jake hesitates, saying he can't do it alone, but Abby insists he can, as long as he follows her notes. She leaves the room, glancing back at Jake as he sits at his desk, staring at her notes. After Abby leaves, Jake continues reading her notes while holding her exercise book. When he looks up, he notices his exam paper with the failing grade, and a hopeless expression crosses his face. He leans back in his chair, lost in thought, then picks up the book, A Guide to Marine Animals. He flips through it, then sets it on top of his failing exam exam paper and returns to Abby's notes. As Jake follows Abby's instructions, his laptop notifies him of a video call. He answers to see Charles, Einstein, and Max on the screen. Charles asks how Jake is doing, and Jake admits he's not well. Charles is surrounded by unfamiliar objects with human-like and archaeological designs. Einstein's background includes a globe and maps, as he seems eager to discuss something military-related. Jake, uninterested, ends the call by clicking the button on his laptop. Jake resumes working, but his brother Mike enters the room, then asks what Jake's girlfriend brought him. He picks up the tubes Abby brought and starts pouring one liquid into another, joking about creating a reaction. Jake gets upset and tells Mike to stop as some liquid spills, but Mike ignores him, laughing. Mike finally puts the tubes back, and Jake, frustrated, tells him to leave. Mike mocks him and leaves the room. Jake checks the tubes and notices some liquid has sprayed onto Abby's notebook. He punches the table in frustration, accidentally knocking over the protein shake. The spilled shake mixes with the liquid, creating a reaction. Later that night, Jake is asleep in his messy room when a strange sound wakes him. Grabbing a flashlight, he investigates and sees a small dinosaur in his room. When Jake shines the light on it, he notices footprints on the floor. Jake spots the dinosaur near the door, half hidden. Excited, he throws a magnet toward it, and the dinosaur eats it. Jake names the dinosaur Magnus, after the magnet container.
Magnus, that's what I call you.
As the dinosaur approaches him, Jake looks on in awe. In the morning, Jennifer enters Jake's messy room and wakes him up. Upset by the state of the room, she picks up clothes from the floor and scolds Jake for the mess. Jake hides the little dinosaur, Magnus, under a cloth on his knees. Jennifer tells Jake to clean up the room when he gets back and to hurry up and get dressed, then leaves the room. Jake, relieved, checks under the cloth, but Magnus is gone. He searches under the bed and around the room but can't find him. Convinced it might have been a dream, Jake heads to the bathroom. While brushing his teeth and looking in the mirror, Jake hears a sound behind him. He turns to see Magnus swimming in the bathtub. Just then, Mike knocks on the bathroom door, yelling for Jake to open it. Jake quickly removes his t-shirt, wraps Magnus in it, and opens the door. Once inside, Jake dries his hair with a towel while Magnus tries to wander around. Jake tells Magnus to stay put, and the dinosaur sits on the floor. Jake gets dressed and prepares to leave, but Magnus attempts to follow. Jake tells Magnus to stay, promising to return, then closes the door behind him. Jake climbs in the car and tells her he isn't feeling well, holding his stomach. Jennifer mentions he seemed fine 5 minutes ago and accuses him of making excuses because he's grounded. Jake insists he's sick, but Jennifer dismisses it and orders him into the car. As they drive off, Jake notices Magnus in his bedroom window, tapping on the glass. Jake tries to motion for Magnus to go back, but Jennifer catches him gesturing and asks what he's doing. She stops the car and steps out. Jake panics, thinking she's heading into the house, but Jennifer instead confronts Mike.
Where do you think you're going?
As Magnus watches from the window, unnoticed. At Brightwood Town Hall, Dr. Frank Tansey, an epidemiologist and Abby's father, greets the audience and explains that he's investigating a new disease in Brightwood. The audience whispers among themselves. Meanwhile, back at the house, Magnus roams freely, playing and making a mess. He tumbles down the stairs, dragging a piece of fabric stuck to his leg, and lands in the living room. At the town hall, 2 fishermen stand before the audience. They claim to have discovered a monster. As they speak, Colonel Roderick, a bald man in military uniform, enters with heavy footsteps and introduces himself. Taking the microphone from Dr. Tansey, Colonel Roderick states that his team is here to protect Brightwood and work with the DPA. The audience reacts loudly, with some raising concerns. Colonel Roderick comments on the townspeople's imaginations, calling it wonderful. The fishermen, determined to prove their claim, present a strange creature from a box they are holding. The audience leans forward to see. In the living room, Magnus continues playing with objects, rolling wheels on the floor and bumping into dining table legs and chairs. At the town hall, Colonel Roderick dismisses the creature as a catfish. One fisherman stands up, insisting it's super weird, while the other agrees.
Super weird.
Dr. Tansey suggests taking the creature for testing, but before he can act, the military team seizes the box. As Dr. Frank heads out, Abby calls out to him, with Jennifer and Jake standing beside her. Jennifer introduces herself. Dr. Frank politely excuses himself. Meanwhile, Magnus finds an open window and sees a tree outside. He attempts to grab it, but the tree falls over. When Jennifer and Jake return home, Jake spots Magnus outside and sneaks him back inside. When Jennifer enters the house and sees the mess, she yells in frustration, questioning what happened. Dr. Frank and Abby follow a military convoy in Frank's car. Abby, sitting in the passenger seat, asks why they're following the military and why the soldiers took the fisherman's discovery. Dr. Frank explains that he's trying to find out as well. When the military vehicles stop, he gets out and approaches the soldiers, who are holding guns. Colonel Roderick steps out to meet Dr. Frank and asks if he's lost. Frank explains there's been a misunderstanding and says he's here to retrieve the specimen. Roderick demands specifics, and Frank emphasizes his credentials. However, Roderick refuses, stating Frank will need an official letter to obtain it. Roderick warns Frank not to push the matter, implying a threat, and tells him to leave. Frank returns to the car, and when Abby asks what happened, he avoids answering. He takes her phone and disables her location settings, asking her to promise not to turn it back on. Abby reluctantly agrees. Later, Jake opens the book their father gave him and Mike, while Magnus stands on the table. Jake browses his laptop when Magnus suddenly vomits. Alarmed, Jake tries to stop him, but Magnus continues, and suddenly his size increases. At that moment, Jake's laptop signals an incoming video call. Jake covers the camera and answers. Charles asks why the video isn't working.
Jake, what's up? Where's your video?
Camera's dead.
And Jake lies, saying his camera is broken. Charles invites Jake to join them for another trip to the forest. Jake, distracted by Magnus moving toward the door, tells Charles he has to go and ends the call. Jake hears the doorbell and sees Abby arriving at their house. He opens the door, looking nervous. Abby greets him and begins talking about their science project involving the strange sludge. Jake tells her he can't work on it now. Abby notices his anxious demeanor and asks if he's okay. Jake insists he's fine. Suddenly, a loud crash comes from inside the house. Abby asks about the noise, but Jake brushes it off as nothing and shuts the door. Inside, Jake finds Magnus, who caused the noise. Abby, however, opens the door herself and follows him upstairs. Jake is shocked to see her in the hallway and asks what she's doing. Abby demands to know what's going on. Jake asks her to promise not to tell anyone before he explains. Abby hesitates, but eventually agrees. Jake then opens his bedroom door. Abby sees Magnus and screams. Jake hurriedly explains that it was a result of a small experiment gone wrong. Abby suggests taking Magnus to her dad, fearing he could be dangerous. Jake refuses, convinced that the military or scientists would harm Magnus. He reassures Abby that Magnus is smart and harmless. Abby, softening, tells Magnus he is now officially their research project, speaking to him as though he understands. Under a bridge, Mike sprays graffiti on a wall. Unbeknownst to him, liquid drips from his bag and mixes with a strange substance on the ground. As Mike hears the sound of a car approaching, he quickly packs up and leaves. The reaction caused by the mixture results in the appearance of insects. At night, Officer Alan Faraday drives his car to a damaged warehouse, holding a flashlight in one hand and speaking into his radio. Alan reports his location at the warehouse,
On-site responding to 4598.
noting broken windows, and finishes his message before returning the radio to his car. A military convoy arrives behind him, and soldiers armed with guns step out and approach the warehouse. Alan greets them and asks why they're there. Colonel Roderick steps forward and tells him they will handle it now. Frustrated, Alan presses further, asking what's going on, but the colonel repeats his earlier statement and heads toward the warehouse with his team. Left confused, Alan radios dispatch, asking if there's been any report of a military operation. Dispatch replies there's no such assignment. Alan mutters about being removed from his own investigation, gets in his car, and drives away. As he leaves, Colonel Roderick orders his team to turn off the lights, and they comply. At home, Mike sits on the kitchen counter reading a book. Jake goes to get some water and notices the mess outside through the window. Mike, wearing a t-shirt, grabs his bag to leave the house. Jake reminds him he's grounded, but Mike ignores him. Jake retrieves a flower from the trash. Just as Abby arrives, they head to Jake's bedroom together, where they find Magnus. Abby notices Magnus has grown. They discuss their concern about Magnus growing so quickly. Jake brings up the book their dad gave them, suggesting it might help identify Magnus. Abby sits on the bed holding Magnus and says she doesn't think he's a fish. Standing from the bed, Abby joins Jake. Magnus, feeling ignored, pushes Jake playfully and sits between them. Meanwhile, Dr. Frank Tansey is at a lake surrounded by trees. He holds a bottle and collects samples for his investigation. He notices containers marked "Danger Nearby" and marks the location on his map before returning to his car. Frank calls Agent Martinez, informing the receptionist that he's found something at Brightwood. At the hospital, Jennifer sits at her desk. She makes a call to Frank using the hospital phone, leaving him a voicemail. Her personal phone rings and she anxiously answers, worried it might be about Mike. Instead, it's Frank who reassures her and suggests they have dinner together. They agree to meet the next day at 7. In Jake's bedroom, Abby stands by the window, looking at pictures. Turning back to his laptop, Jake tells Abby he doesn't want things to change. Magnus suddenly makes a sound, startling Abby. Jake admits he forgot to mention that Magnus has grown 2 feet. Upset, Abby scolds him for leaving out such an important detail. She sits back in the chair and starts doing calculations, suggesting they show Magnus to her dad. Jake refuses, worried Magnus might be harmed. At that moment, Jake's friends burst into the room. When they see Magnus, they freeze, afraid. Jake tells them to relax, assuring them Magnus won't hurt anyone. The group panics, saying Magnus is the creature everyone, including Officer Faraday, is looking for. Jake introduces Magnus by name. Charles, excited, suggests posting Magnus on his channel, calling it the find of the century. Jake begs Charles not to do it, appealing to their friendship. Charles accuses Jake of not trusting him enough to share this earlier and claims Jake only cares about his girlfriend, Abby. Charles storms out of the room without filming Magnus. Max and Einstein follow him.
I gotta go.
Jake lays on his bed with his shoes still on, asking Magnus to join him, but Magnus curls up and sleeps on the floor. At home, Abby talks to her dad, but notices the bottle and asks about it. Dr. Tansey explains they plan to perform an autopsy to determine if the organism inside is dead. Abby listens, but ultimately decides not to tell him about Magnus. Jake, holding one of their father's belongings, heads to the garage. Mike sees him and asks why he keeps using their dad's things. When Mike tries to enter the garage, Jake blocks him, prompting Mike to tease him, asking if Jake is hiding his girlfriend in there. Jake finally agrees to show him, but makes Mike promise not to tell anyone. Inside the garage, Mike throws pillows aside, searching, until Magnus reveals himself. Shocked, Mike asks Jake what Magnus is. Jake admits he doesn't know. The brothers sit on the floor, watching Magnus. Mike recalls a fishing trip with their dad, where he caught an eel and brought it home, and Jake laughs, remembering how their mom freaked out. Meanwhile, 2 fishermen are out on a boat. They reel in what looks like a shark, but the creature suddenly faints on their boat. Both men panic and shout. Dr. Tansey tries calling Colonel Roderick's office, requesting a meeting and identifying himself as a representative of the EPA. The receptionist puts him on hold, but the call abruptly ends. Frustrated, Frank receives another call about a town meeting. At home, Jennifer tells Jake she'll drive him and Mike to school, saying it's time to start their day as a family. Jake, surprised, points out that she's never driven them to school before. Jennifer insists, and Mike, coming down the stairs, asks Jake what's going on. Jake tells him Jennifer's plan.
And what? Driving us to school.
In the car, Mike sits beside Jennifer and complains about her suggestion to eat breakfast together. Jennifer tells him it's time to move on, as it's been 2 years since their father passed. Upset, Mike accuses Jennifer of letting Officer Faraday replace their dad, asking if 2 years is enough to move on. Jennifer insists she's not replacing anyone, just trying to find happiness. Angry, Jennifer pulls over and orders Mike to get out of the car. She drives off, leaving both brothers standing on the road with their bags. The search for Magnus continues. Colonel Roderick, still in charge of the operation, orders everyone to look thoroughly. Abby goes to Jake's house, but Magnus startles her. Jake and Mike walk in time and stop Magnus from attacking her. Mike tells Jake this is dangerous, and they must get rid of him. When Jake refuses, they argue, and Mike walks out. Outside, Alan calls Mike and starts their usual argument. Abby comes in time and lies about the reason they are not in school. The boys see a UFO while rigging their bicycle and follow it to see what it is, but they are shocked to see dinosaurs all over. Back at home, Mike and Jake argue about Magnus.
Thing is dangerous. You saw what he did to Abby.
Jake walks out of the house, and Charles, Max, and Anistian run to his house to tell him about what they discovered. Colonel Roderick arrives at Jake's home at that, but is unable to find anything. Abby and Jake had to take Magnus along with them to hide it. While there, they see the UFO, but their friends warn them to hide from it. Magnus, who was also hiding from them, takes down the UFO. It turns out it was not a UFO, but a drone that Colonel Roderick had sent. Colonel Roderick sees his drone getting trashed by a dinosaur. Jake and Abby take Magnus to a tunnel, and Jake reassures Magnus that everything will be okay. Sad, Jake starts to walk back. Magnus gets out of the tunnels and runs on the street, being chased by police officers. Jake tries to stop Colonel Roderick's team, but his pleas are ignored. Jake sits home, sad and broken by the loss of his friend. The team that captures Magnus hangs Magnus to start experimenting on him. Jake, Abby, Max, Einstein, Mike, and Alan decide to work together on a rescue mission. They all get ready and get in Alan's car, planning their move. They manage to get through the gate. They all then split, with each of them given their own tasks. Max, Mike, and Jake walk into the room where Magnus is being held. Magnus is too weak to move, but Jake refuses to give up.
Jake, leave it. You have to go.
Meanwhile, Abby and Alan discover a confidential paper. While the three are trying to make Magnus get up, Colonel Roderick arrives, capturing them. He confronts Jake about how he made him, and Jake tries to recall the mix of chemicals he spilled back then. Colonel Roderick doesn't believe him, but Magnus creates enough commotion for them to escape. They escape, but Magnus, instead of following them, turns to attack their pursuers. The group is captured by Colonel Roderick, but Charles's stream has captured everything, and now Colonel Roderick gets exposed for the harm he caused with the mysterious blue goo. After the ordeal, Magnus, now resembling Styracosaurus, transforms into a small flying dinosaur and is able to live the rest of his life in peace. The story teaches that friendship, courage, and teamwork can overcome even the most daunting challenges, as Jake and his friends band together to protect Magnus and uncover the truth.